if you look at our website, by the way, which we can put in the chat, the link for that. If you look at our website, there will be, full programs for all the events that I'm announcing now. But yes, on May 12th, our guest speaker will be Dr. Aslı Bali, whom, I'm sure many of you are already familiar with her work. She's a professor at the UCLA School of Law, and the title of her talk is Decentralization as Self-Determination, Reframing the Question of Minority Rights in Turkey. Again, so that's on May 12th. And then after that, I am very excited to announce that we're going to have the 2021 conference, our yearly conference, which we unfortunately had to cancel last year. And when we canceled, we were hoping to have it in person this year. And here we are, more than 1 year later. We still couldn't do it. So we decided to go ahead and hold it in a virtual format. The theme and title of our conference this year is Queer Haller, or Queer Conditions, Social and Political Change in an Age of Authoritarianism. And the conference will take place over 3 successive Saturdays in June. That is June 4th, 11th, and 18th. Again, if you look at the web page, you can find the full conference program there, and I'm really hoping that you'll join us. And as I said, as we do updates, you'll see it. Please, we also have our social media accounts. You can also follow us there. Please spread the word. And so I should just go ahead and introduce our speaker today. Our speaker is Ezgi Çakmak, and Ms. Çakmak is a Ph.D. candidate at the University of Pennsylvania. She is in the Department of Africana Studies, and also, joined with the History Department. And before starting this, her doctorate, Ms. Çakmak actually worked with NGOs, in the field of immigration, international immigration specifically. And she did field work in Istanbul with African migrants. So, she's bringing an interesting perspective. But today, the topic of her talk is more historical. And the title of her talk is The Roots of the Silence, Encounters with Blackness in the Early Turkish Republic. I'm going to just stop talking here and leave the floor to Ezgi. Please send your questions in the chat box to us. We'll collate them. And after Ms. Çakmak's talk, I'm going to, read the questions, and we'll try to take as many as possible. Thank you. Ezgi, please.
Thank you, Professor Yosmoğlu, for having me here, and thank you, Deniz. And I'd like to thank Cayman Modern Turkish Studies program for giving me this opportunity to be the third speaker on the series, Reflections on Whiteness, Blackness, and Race in the Ottoman Empire and Republic of Turkey. As the title of my speech, The Roots of the Silence, Encounters with Blackness in Early Turkish Republic, hints that today I will be speaking about how Black Lives Matter movement sparked a recent interest in the discussions of race in Turkey following the anti-racism protests in the US last May, and how this moment of interest can be used as a window onto the historical and social processes of racial formation, and particularly the perception of Blackness in Turkey. Following the murder of George Floyd last May, protests demanding racial equality and justice occupied the streets of US cities, but voices of them echoed in many countries all around the world. Although racism, anti-Blackness, and discrimination against people of color have been seen as the problems of quote-unquote the West, the global spread of protests and debates signaled an urgent moment to rethink and discuss the notions of race, processes of racialization and discrimination in other localities as well. Black Lives Matter protests appear in the parts of the Western Hemisphere where the intertwined histories of empire, race, slavery, and colonialism are perceived and studied as indigenous notions of these geographies. At the background of this assumption lays the singularity of the narrative around these concepts, which posits the dichotomous relationship between Blackness and Whiteness in the US as the normative model for racial studies. And the same perception posits the transatlantic slavery and Western imperialism, again as a normative model for the slavery studies. From this perspective, Turkey appears as an unexpected place to see a protest against racism, as it has been an unexpected place to see Blackness, and again, an unexpected place to discuss these notions of race, slavery, and nation in relation to the history of imperialism within the geography. The crowds gather in front of the US Embassy in Ankara and Trump Tower and the US Consulate in Istanbul were mostly from the socialist groups who centered the protest team around the opposition to the US imperialism and capitalism, but barely touched on the Black identity, racialized bodies, and racial inequality. Because these notions have been treated as foreign and as outsiders to the realities of Turkey. The foreignness of these notions, I argue, supported by the official narrative in the early Turkish Republic, perpetuated by the academia up until the recent impressive contributions, and finally claimed by the society, and interestingly, by the population of African descent themselves. The perception of race, slavery, and diasporas as the product of the Western world not only prevents the historical studies flourish in the Middle Eastern historiography, but also obscures the other processes of marginalization and racialization in the society. Esma Durugül, who penned one of the very first pieces regarding the invisibility of history of Blackness and cultural identity of African descent in Turkey, urges a new historiography, as so far, I quote, Turkey has been unable to deal with the facts surrounding the existence of Afroturks, end of quote. Regarding the reason behind this inability, she makes her mostly cited statement in the article published in the Journal of Black Studies. She says, both in the Ottoman era as well as the Republican era, Africans have been considered as Turks and Muslims. As a consequence, Afro-Turks are virtually statistically non-existent in the official demographic records of the Ottoman and Republican eras of Turkish history. I was not even in the grad school when I first read this sentence and took it as a discouragement in proceeding the research on the history of African enslavement in the Ottoman Empire. But later in years, I read the works of many scholars of slavery from different parts of the world. And I realized the paucity of the archives is a shared problem. And that problem is even more serious for the scholars of slavery in the Middle East and Indian Ocean, meaning mostly for the scholars who work on non-Western geographies. But Marisa Fuentes' question helped me at this point. She asks, how do you narrate the fleeting glimpses of enslaved subjects in the archives and meet the disciplinary demands of history that requires us to construct a coherent historical accounting out of that which defies coherence and representability? So in a region where the history of slavery and race has been covered with silence, and the attempts to uncover this has been criticized for reflecting the Western perceptions and vocabularies to a non-Western context, how do we, and by we I mean the scholars of slavery in the Middle East, give an account to that past? How can the history be written for the group of African descents in Turkey who has ephemeral archival presence, again in the words of Marisa Fuentes, in relation to the racial legacy of slavery? What these absences and silence in the archive and the historiography reveal, as well as hinder, and what other kinds of methodologies could be employed? And finally, how can a study of historicity on Blackness be pursued in an unexpected place? In my broader project, I look at the entangled histories of Blackness and slavery from the ban of the African slave trade in 1857 until the abolition of the institution in 1933, and try to problematize the joint formulation of racial and national identity during this transition period. But today, I'm going to focus on the first decade of the Republic to trace the ways in which Blackness and history of slavery transmitted into the nation state order. What I would like to look at is changing perception of Blackness as embodied difference during the early Republican period, when the state's modernization project became much more invested in racial discourse. The silence developed around Blackness was deeply related to the efforts taken by the Republic after its foundation in 1923 to recast a nation different from the remnants of a once multi-ethnic empire. This nation was to be homogeneous, not only in language and culture, but also in ethno-racial identity. The efforts that the new nation state paid right after its foundation was not only to determine the conditions of inclusion to national community, but to recast that we're nation itself. Slavery and Blackness were seen as the subjects of that heterogeneous history, which Republican Revolution ended and created a cohesion in Turkishness instead. Formerly enslaved Africans, therefore, were hailing from the imperial past, which was not claimed by the Republic. What Blackness distilled is the imprint of slavery, which belonged to a heterogeneous imperial imaginary. Therefore, it contradicts with the both discursive and visual premises of the homogeneous nation state. Here I have two slides to show how association of Blackness and slavery encounter with the official narrative and how Blackness was perceived as the visual reminder of the imperial past. The first one is from the book entitled From the Ottoman Empire to the Republic of Turkey, How Was It, How Is It Now? Prepared by Vedat Nedim and Burhan Asaf to celebrate the 10th anniversary of the Republic in 1933. It allocated all the pages on the left to the visuals of the Ottoman Empire, juxtaposing the ones from the new Republic on the right side. As the comparison was the central theme of the book, this before and after structure continued over various matters like regime change, education, and religious affairs. Each of the matters was explained through two sharply contrasted images depicting the failures and incapacity of the Ottoman Empire on the left, and acceleration and accomplishments of the Republic on the other. And on the left, along with two Shehzadets, the portrait of Black Eunuch, who was actually famous Nadir Ağa, the well-known Black Eunuch of Abdülhamit II, also needed to complete the picture of this empire. And the second picture is from an earlier period, 1924 dated Resimli Ay journal. And the article that I got this image from aims to underscore the rupture between the past and the present, like the previous one, through sexualization of the palace and harem slavery. But again, it also needed the Black eunuch to complete the imperial image. And under the image of a Black eunuch, the article stated that the most wretched creature of the palace, the Black eunuch. Again, an imperial imaginary could be only completed by the presence of Black body. Although Black citizens are virtually statistically non-existent, referring back to Durgun's statement, I detect three moments of confrontation between the public's fascination with Turkish whiteness and the visual reminders of the imperial past. These encounters, I argue, reveal the ethno-racial operation of Turkishness and the arbitrary conditions of inclusion and exclusion to the national unity. The first site of the encounter was the Kalf Festival. In November 1925, dervish convents and religious lodges were closed down and banned by the law number 677. First article of the law declared the closure of lodges, shrines, and prohibited their ceremonies along with the visits to tombs. It was the first and most radical step taken within the reform movement towards secularization and has still been the central content of the controversies around the freedom of religion in Turkey. The law announced no other Islamic places of worship other than mosques and masjids lawful. It introduced a new set of regulations, setting the boundaries for the religious affairs and most particularly Muslim citizenship. Among many of the targeted groups and celebration rituals was the Kal Festival or Arap Düğünü, Arab wedding, which was held by the enslaved and emancipated Africans in Istanbul and Izmir. Although the content and timing of the festivity vary according to the limited sources, the celebrations in the month of May, gathering many Africans together in public, goes as early as the late 16th century. The festival lasts 4 consecutive weeks, where the cult was decorated with wire, money, and napkins, and walked around with dances and tambourine rhythms for the first 3 weeks. And in the last week, the cult was killed by the Godia or Kolbaşı, the leader of the community and mostly a woman, and skinned. And later its meat was cooked with, again, a ceremony of dances and drums, and later distributed to the community. According to the observance account on Kal Festival, the healing rituals like emitting sounds, fumigation, and trance dance seem to be common parts of the festivity in both cities, again in Izmir and Istanbul. Also, the high attention shown by the rest of the public towards the festival explain the significant position of the event in the literary sources. The visibility of quote-unquote un-Islamic practices facilitated by a group of Africans was not welcomed by neither the imperial nor the nation state. The way the gatherings show up in the official archival records indicates the moments of confrontation between the authorities and the Africans over the inappropriateness of their practices vis-a-vis Islam. The inadmissible acts contrary to Islam had been the main theme of the official interference into the communal presence of Africans in the Ottoman Empire from the 16th to 19th century and in the early Turkish Republic. Because the law of 1925, which prohibited the practice of Sufi orders, prevented African population from holding the Kal Festival. Consequently, the image of the gatherings started to fade away from the public's memory. Mustafa Alpac, who was the founder of the Africans Culture and Solidarity Association, revived this cultural ritual in 2007 and gathered many African descents together each year around the Kal Festival ceremony after its decades of silence. The second area of encounter was the application of surname law. In June 1934, Grand National Assembly of Turkey issued the Law on Family Names, which required each citizen to adopt a family name that must be taken from the Turkish language, Öztürkçe. The law urged every Turk to adopt a proper surname given a 2-year period, in addition to his/her first name. The law passed with a strong claim of providing equality in the society through elimination of the names indicating rank and civil officialdom. And Article 3 forbade the use of all religious and military titles, as well as names that are related to foreign races and ethnicities. The rationale of the surname law was explained in the parliament as these honorific titles and foreign names contravene the national unity. The deputy of Muğla, Şükrü Kaya, pointed out the danger of division that these names encourage and noted, I quote, "Why should we call them Kurdish Mehmet, Circassian Hassan, or Laz Ali? First of all, such a thing would show the weakness of the majority itself. We should abolish these divisions," end of quote. As the example of foreign names were belonging to ethnic and religious minority groups of the country, including the Armenian, Greek, as well as Kurdish, Persian, and Arabic communities, the main goal of the state was to make a strong emphasis on the ethnic and religious borders of the Turkish nationhood. The surname regulation forbade the use of suffixes like veled, bin, or zade, associated with Arabic and Persian identity, also the suffix yan for Armenians, and this aki, pulos for the Greeks. The population records show that number of people from minority groups that changed their surname either through the elimination of the suffix, which was regarded as the marker of the ethnicity, or changed the suffixes with the endings of oğlu, which means son of in Turkish. Yet, what if the marker of difference was the body itself? What could be the surnaming practices for them? Although not included in the scholarly analysis on the early republic in Turkey, the mandatory adoption of a Turkish family name affected another ex-imperial population other than religious and ethnic minority groups, and that is the community of African descent people of Turkey. Recently known as Afroturks, the Black citizens of Turkey were given the color words such as Kara, Esmer, Arap, and Zenci. Surnames such as Karabay, Karakartal, Karaboğa, Esmer Khan are among the examples that African descendants mostly carry as their surname. According to Meltem Turkos, the surname law was applied in the same line of motivation with the other reform measures of the early Republican era that are modernizing, secularizing, and homogenizing the nation. Applications of the surname law provides as an alternate site for approaching the relations between the state and various groups that it sought to incorporate, assimilate, and transform. In the case of Turkish surname law, the emphasis on the idea of unified nation, which was seen achievable through the language unification, went hand in hand with the premises of legibility. At this very point, how could we read the early Republican states' desire to eliminate the names indicating non-Turkishness, yet assignation of a color word to other citizens who were known to be descendants of formerly enslaved population? It's even more surprising when we think that African descendants are already, backing to the reference from Durgönül, virtually statistically non-existent in the official demographic records. That means they have not ever been legible for the state. The third area that I found an encounter between descendants of formerly enslaved population and the state was the application the cases, lawsuits of insulting Turkishness. Turkish Penal Code number 765 had passed through the Grand National Assembly on March 1st, 1926. The articles number 158, 159, and 160 under the section of crimes against state forces were describing the content of crimes in detail. Accordingly, article number 158 was to punish those who insult and or confront the president of the Turkish Republic. The range of crime is wider in article number 159, which punishes those who insult Grand National Assembly and the personality of the government, and who insult and deride Turkishness, Türklüğü tahrir ve tezif edenler. Article 159, with its emphasis on insulting Turkishness, constitutes the very first version of infamously known Article 301, which took effect on June 1st, 2005, and functioned as a censorship mechanism in various realms against the freedom of expression in the society. But Article 159 not only functioned as a censorship mechanism for any kind of criticism towards official authorities, but also introduced a concrete racial boundaries of citizenship. The paucity of sources is yet again an interesting and limiting fact regarding the historiography of early Turkish Republic. Cemil Koçak has penned the only article about these lawsuits opened based on Article 159's premise of protecting Turkishness during the years between 1926 to 1942. He also points out the majority of the cases were opened against the members of non-Muslim groups. Some of the cases deliberately states the person's ethnic and religious identity by referring them as Greek Madame Marie, Bulgarian Panayot Christo, or Jewish Victoria, while some others only state the place of origin and the first name, along with the name of the father. Although the majority of the cases were opened against the non-Muslims, there were cases in which the non-Turkish Muslim groups were involved, and they were referred as Kurdish, Circassian, and Laz. Unfortunately, the documents in the archive only consist of the regular correspondences between the Grand National Assembly and the Ministry of Justice, because the Article 160 says that the prosecution of denunciations will be conducted by the Minister of Justice, but only upon the approval by the Grand National Assembly. The documents of these correspondences solely mention about the person's identity, place of origin, and the article they were going to be on trial. Therefore, the content of the denunciations is still out of reach, which would enlighten what was regarded as insulting Turkishness if the accused persons could how they defended themselves. Among many lawsuits, there were cases of which locality and identity formation point out a different angle to interpret the definition of Turkishness. In 1927, Arap Mustafa from Kırkağaç, Manisa, Arap Mehmet and Arap Hüseyin from Izmir in the same year of 1929, Arap Bilal from Burhaniye in 1931, were among the ones who were accused of insulting Turkishness. The information of the locality and the nicknames together indicate that these cases were opened against Black citizens of the Republic. Arap had been used as a nickname indicating Blackness. Based on her analysis on the census data of 1885 and 1907, Ferhunda Özbay reveals that the late Ottoman households tended to register white slaves as from Cherkesistan, land of Circassians, and Black slaves from Arabistan. So the prevalent use of this nickname could be derived from its use in the official records. Yet also the association between Arabness and Blackness well passed into the Republican era, long enough to see that nickname used for Black persons in various cultural productions of the period, novels, rhymes, and most visibly in the movies of 1960s is in the form of Arapacı. Additionally, these denunciations took place in the cities of Western and Southern Anatolia, such as Izmir, Manisa, Balıkesir, İçel, Adana, which were the localities known to have received the majority of emancipated Africans following Abdülhamit II's last measure to suppress the slave trade in 1882. What these cases point out with their parts that we can know and with the parts that we will never know is the range of variables defining the terms of inclusivity and exclusivity pertaining to Turkishness. As I try to discuss today, that the official measures and reforms, although they aim to unite the disordered multiplicity and fragmentation that non-Muslim and non-Turkish groups represent, in fact, they had affected another group, albeit in a subtle way, that was inherited from the imperial past. Being statistically non-existent, yet also exposed to flexible and arbitrary criteria of citizenship in early Republican era, constitute the basis for the silence over the history of African descents in Turkey. And finally, I cannot end this talk without mentioning Mustafa Alpac, who shed the first light on the history of Africans in Turkey by sharing his own family narrative with the society. Firstly, he wrote From Slavery to Freedom, Arab Woman Kemale, the biography of his mother in a short volume, and then that short volume evolved into his most well-known work, Kenya, Crete, Istanbul, Human Biographies from the Slave Coast in 2005. He also wrote an article in 2013, published by the Journal of Social Sciences faculty at Ankara University, with the title, The Ottoman Empire Slave, the Foster Child in Turkish Republic, Afroturks. Also, as I mentioned before, he founded Africans Culture and Solidarity Association in 2006, which organizes the annual Kaf Festival. Mustafa Alpac passed away in 2016, but the story he told the society by starting saying that the first generation leaves, second generation denies, third generation researches, continues to be powerful motivation for many. Thank you.
Thank you, Ezgi, for this wonderful talk. And I'm going to now ask our listeners to send in their questions, type them into the chat box and address them to me or Deniz Ruiz. Will be taking them and I'll be reading them in a moment. But while you're doing that, Let me also remind you, as I said at the beginning, this is the third of a talk series. There will be more starting in the fall. And the first two talks were by Ezgi Güner and Baki Tezcan, covering the period from the Ottoman Empire to, contemporary Turkey. And these two talks, Baki Tezcan's talk is available. The link is there on our website, and also I think on YouTube. If you just go click on it again, we can provide the link here. Ezgi Güner's talk was also recorded, but you need to register to have access to that talk. And in addition to these, some of our as we switched to this virtual platform, we seized this opportunity and started recording the talks and making it accessible after the events were over. So those are also on our website. I recommend that you take a look. There may be something you're interested in, and we're going to try to continue doing this going forward. So I am looking at the okay, there are some questions now. I'm going to read the first one. It is from James Ryan. And by the way, if you don't want me to read your name for some reason, I just denote it at the beginning of your message. Otherwise, I'll be reading your names. And this question is coming from James Ryan, and he's asking, I know that the archives on these sorts of lawsuits are closed, but it is my understanding that the defendants in most of these cases were provided with copies of the court transcripts following the close of the trial. If it were possible to track down the descendants of these defendants, perhaps some more documents from these trials could be dug up. Similarly, I know that it was usual in the more prominent prosecutions under those articles for indictments to be published in Ayn Tarihi. I wonder if any of those cases registered there. If you'd like, I'm going to, let you answer that first, and then,
I think it's a comment and suggestion rather than a question, and I think I'll thank for Jim for that, and definitely check Ayn Tarihi. But so far, as I mentioned in the paper, I could only find the correspondences between the Ministry of Justice and the Grand National Assembly. But thanks for the tip, Jim.
Yeah, and I suppose it's also a matter of if you were able to track down the descendants.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I'm wondering, how willing people would be to share this kind of information, since they may not want to admit that they were indicted. Their forefathers were indicted for insulting Turkishness. Okay, I'm reading a question by Anush Suni, and she's thanking Ezgi, and I would like to ask about the relation between Black citizens of Turkey and other minorities, Armenians and Kurds, for instance, and how they are constructed and represented, or how they represent themselves and negotiate their positions in the country vis-a-vis each other.
How Afroturks present themselves vis-a-vis the minority groups?
Other minority groups.
Yeah. Actually, Barış Ünlü states that in his famous book, Turkish Contracted Turkishness of I couldn't remember Turkishness contract. Anyway, he was mentioning how racialized body and the constant other would behave and present themselves in silence. He rather prefers to adopt the silence that was imposed by the official narrative to themselves in order not to raise his or her voice and to keep its like low profiles. So Afroturks, I would say the same thing. So they would not claim their own Blackness as an identity, but rather stay silent. So vis-a-vis other minorities, they would do the same thing. They will not adopt and accept the position of minority, but rather stay as a silent member of the society.
Thank you. Let me unmute myself. There is now another question from Lerna Ekmekçioğlu. This is great. Thanks, Ezgi. Just curious about how the novels of the era or the autobiographies, memoirs mention the Blacks. I'm currently studying Halide Edip, whose memoirs is a treasure in this regard. Her Ethiopian slave, she is everywhere. What is interesting about Halide Edip is that she knows slavery is bad, therefore she tries to present it as soft as possible and with all tropes of cannibalism, etc. So would you like to respond to that?
Yeah, thank you for that question and comment. I would suggest Tell This in My Memory book by Iltrat Pavel, because she was the first one who came up with Halide Edip's presentation of her African enslaved. And actually, she was deliberately using very mean vocabulary when she was describing her Reshe and her grandma's enslaved people in their household. But in the novels in general, we can see the pair of Blackness and slavery went hand in hand. So other than being the servant or slave, I don't remember any other example that a Black person appear in a novel of the period.
Okay, next we have a question from Esra Çimencioğlu. Thank you so much for the presentation. You briefly mentioned Arap Bacı as one of the most visible, iconic Afro-Turkish figure in the modern history of Turkey. What does this representation mean for the Black community? Any further comments on this? And I'm going to piggyback on this question and, remind, people may not be familiar with this, but there was also a tradition of blackface in Turkey. People may have forgotten about it. So if we could also combine that with the Arap Bacı, this, main figure, I was wondering if you would, care to comment a little bit on that, this popular cultural representation of Blackness.
But blackface was used as a role of Arap Bacı in TV series and movies, right? Other than that, I don't know any or in theaters, like men's making black faces, personalizing the Arap Bacı figure in theaters and in movies as well. And it's the same case in Iran. Bita Bakrudzadeh studies this topic in Bucknell University, so you can check her works on that as well. But regarding Arap Bacı, so the ban on slave trade was in 1857, but the institution of slavery continued clandestinely as a practice up until 1933, when the Turkish public officially signed the Geneva Convention. Cultural demise of slavery prolonged in the history, and the main mode of slavery in 19th century was domestic slavery, dominated by African and females, and Arap Bacı was the continuation of that figures. Because even they got the manumission, they wanted to stay in the same households in order to seek for the protection and and the livelihood. So figures of Arap Bacı was the continuation of that history. Also, having slaves not only bring an economic value, but also a cultural value, a prestige. So having a slave, particularly since we know the association of blackness and slavery, having an African slave within the household would definitely mean a wealthy elite household, particularly when it comes to Black eunuch. Even as Baki Tezcan also mentioned, even in the 18th century, having a Black eunuch meant an upper elite household statement. So I hope it was an answer.
Yes, and Esra just added that Tevfik Gelenbe was the most famous.
Exactly, for the blackface, exactly.
Yeah, and I may be wrong, but I vaguely remember. So the Arap Bacı figure was the most common, and it referred almost to like a domestic, form of blackness, right? If I remember correctly, there were also maybe Sadri Alışık, doing blackface, but that was that was depicting maybe blacks as savages, so not our Arap Bacı kind of blackness. I mean, I maybe I vaguely remember this. I don't know if anybody else okay, Mustafa Minawi is adding that we can still,
yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the note.
Maybe somebody else will, remember these movies. My memory may not be serving me well, but it's I suppose it's worth looking into. But I'm going to read another question now, and this is from Herak Papazian. Thank you. I'm interested in the relations between Afroturks and recent African migrants in Istanbul. I'd be glad if you could comment, elaborate on that as well. How do Afroturks approach them, and how does their arrival impact the locals, if at all?
Thank you. That's a really wonderful question, because it was the moment that I wanted to continue to look at the historicity of blackness. Because back then, as İpek Yosmoğlu mentioned in the beginning, I was working with African migrants in Istanbul, and that was not complete but a different experience of blackness. Because blackness, I take it as a like embodied difference, and that embodied difference carry different meanings and affects, and and exposed to changes tied to various currents. So in the case of African migrants, their experience, and I can only talk for Istanbul because that was my site. What shaped their experience of Istanbul was a mix of refuginess, foreignness, and blackness together. And actually, the moment I was appointed as a like local guide for them was hilarious, because we were exposed to same levels of microaggressions on the streets. But then when I start to speak in Turkish, that changed everything. And I was also in the Calf Festival in 2013, when the African Culture and Solidarity Association invited African migrants who had the right to travel, by the way, not all of them are legal, to Izmir to celebrate the Bayram together with them. And I can tell that both groups were not Afro-Turks were amazed to see, but African migrants were amazed to see blackness, as I told, in an unexpected place, because they were not expecting to see that many people who look like them, but rather not speak the same language, not have any aspirations to the continent. Yeah, that's it. It was a different experience in general.
Okay, I'm looking at the questions and comments here, and I'm glad that I'm not going entirely senile. I wasn't imagining things. It was, yeah, the Turist Ömer series. And the title is wonderful. Turist Ömer, yamyamlar arasında. Tourist Ömer among the cannibals. Yeah.
Mm.
So you can imagine, hilarity ensues after that. So there is a question here from Mustafa Minawi, and he's asking, in the late Ottoman Empire, did you come across an explicit expression, white self versus an African other inside the Ottoman Empire? I ask because the notions of whiteness as a characteristic of Ottomanness outside of the Ottoman Empire, particularly through Ottoman travel literature in Africa. And just following up on this, Irvin Cemil Schick has, there's he's adding a comment here. I'm reading it. I hope, it's okay that I read your name. He is saying, echoing Mustafa Minawi, it's worth noting the role of Circassian and Georgian slaves in the construction of whiteness in general, this Caucasianness.
Mm-hmm.
It's not only Turkey, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And he discussed this also in Çerkez Güzeli. And echoing Eleanor Morek, it is worth noting that Black GIs were used in the 1960s in an obviously racist manner by the left, protesting NATO and American imperialism. This is in reference to a comment from Eleanor Morek. I'm going to read that question later. I'm going to first let you respond to, Mustafa's, question.
I think I share the same comment with Circassian versus Africans, because other than that, I try to remember, but I think for Arabness there was a division between whiteness and blackness, and as I come across documents saying Beyaz Arap and Beyaz Gulam as opposed to Zenci and Black Arab. So that could be a difference for white self. But other than that, I will share the same comment with Circassians, how they were representative of the beauty and European-like beauty in the system of slavery, when that's why they were all only employed in the domestic realm, and particularly in the harem slavery. Whereas Africans were exposed to menial jobs.
Okay, so let me go back to this question from Eleanor Morek. I once saw a piece of news in an early Republican newspaper in which a picture of African Americans in suits and coats and hats was used to argue along the lines of, even they got civilized, we can do it too. Have you come across similar material? Could you say something on early Republican reflections on the situation of African Americans and what this meant in early Republican Turkey, possibly also with regard to Turks of African descent?
No, I didn't come across, but I would like to see if the person who asked the question can reach out to me and send. But I remember, and I'm actually working on that topic. The African Americans who converted Islam in early 20s and early 1930s as well wanted to make a colony. Literally, they use that word, colony, in Turkey, and they wrote a letter to Mustafa Kemal, and I saw, and I could find that news both in the U.S. newspapers and Cumhuriyet in Turkey, but they were refused, obviously. But the reason was not clarified in the newspapers. So, but I assume they were not welcomed in the period when the fascination of whiteness prevailed all the official agenda. But for regarding African Americans, I remember that news. Other than that, no, I haven't come across.
Okay, I think you can read Mustafa Menawi's comment. It's an example of, lynching incidents in the U.S. This is a piece in Ikdam, the savagery of the Americans. So they're racist. We're not kind of
Exactly.
yeah. And Oya Topçuoğlu is asking, could you comment on the popularity of public figures in Turkey, like the singer Esmer Ay and sculptor Kuzgun Acar, within the context of Blackness? Again, not the names.
Exactly, Esmer Ay and Kuzgun Acar, exactly. And there are a couple of more people who are known to be Afroturks and had some celebrity but what I can say about this is that art and sports are both safest spaces for Black bodies to appear and to get acknowledged easily. And it's the case in Turkey, and it's the case in the United States. So it's not surprise for me to see well-known names as singer and successful person in sports, but not in the other realms of the society. So, but I don't remember also these two names make explicit comments on their Blackness and their African heritage.
Okay, well, I'm glad Mustafa actually raised this issue of how they saw themselves. The whoever wrote the piece in Ikdam, because it reminds me, in Turkey there's this self-perception, if we can generalize, and I think we can at this instance, that we are not racist. And this is even more vehemently expressed when it comes to racism against Blacks. And I was wondering, since you are approaching this from a historical point of view, you're taking the longer view, if in your research you have come across anything that suggests that this perception is something that changes over time, or can we talk about something that gets imported from prior to the Republic, the Ottoman times to the
I don't think there was a specific time period in both Ottoman Empire and Turkish Republic where the official authorities accepted that, yeah, we are racist, or let's take the critiques of racism seriously and look at. I don't remember, and particularly let's look back at the 1857 when the African slave trade was banned. It was based on the English oppression towards the suppressing the slave trade, and the Ottoman Empire responded that, okay, we are not racist. We can suppress that trade, but behind that actually was the continuation of the institution of slavery first, and also the more intimate part of the slave trade was going through white slavery and Circassians and Georgians, and a gendered version of that was going on. So other than that, when it comes to early Turkish Republic and today's Turkey as well, since race and racism was acknowledged as a dichotomy between Blackness and Whiteness, as I said in the beginning of my presentation, as the US formulation of racism was seen as a normative model, it has been always easy for the rest of the world, including Turkey, And I can add the other Middle Eastern countries to that, to say that it's not our garden to take care of. It's not our business. And that that approach, unfortunately, prevailed in the academia so far, up until the recent really scholarly works. So that approach obscures a lot other levels and ways of marginalization and discriminations that various other groups were exposed to.
Thank you. And of course, I wondered if this is also, you know, somehow connected with conversations about it's you know, race associated with, you know, slavery and, you know, the dichotomy between, you know, black and white, and the difficulty of, you know, overcoming certain, you know, hangups to discuss this in a Middle Eastern and also Turkish context. And I'm wondering if it also has to do with, you know, debates concerning the place of slavery in Islam, and, you know, how on the one hand there is this notion that it's not the same thing as, again, you know, the reference becoming American, you know, chattel slavery, and contrasting that with, you know, oh, look at it, you know, it's not the same kind of slavery. I probably, I'm guessing these may be, you know, some of the themes that not also in the primary sources.
Definitely. Ehud Telodano's first two books actually talk about this, how Islam, and he was kind of hesitant to say or go into deep the real aspects of the practice of enslavement in the Ottoman Empire, because I think he was also having this mind of Islam's effects on the Middle Eastern slavery. But in his later book, As If Silent and Absent, he said that as if we can say that it's a milder version, but there is degrees of violence in the system of enslavement, Ottoman enslavement.
Okay. Ezgi, I also wanted to ask you something that is related, not directly with the talk you gave us today, tangentially, but also your experience. You briefly referred to this, working with African migrants in Turkey. And I was wondering if this is something that you will be using, this kind of methodology. I don't know if you were at all thinking about, you know, this taking you to a dissertation project, more historically oriented. And if you could tell us a little bit about, you know, how your thinking went from, you know, this field work to, it seems like you're now doing more archival work. I don't know if you would care to comment on that.
Yeah, sure, surely. Yeah, actually, it was the collection of moments that I experienced with African migrants, because I encountered many times the role of silence in the society, and regarding the presence of Blackness in Turkey, because the attitudes, the slang words, and malbehaviors that African migrants were exposed to in Istanbul was like as if the city dwellers or Turkish people in general have not been into close contact with Blacks before. So it's just they are migrants cannot change the whole system. And actually, Murat Ergen's latest article is excellent in explaining the different levels of understanding and perception of Blackness in Turkey. He took African migrants, a celebrity, African celebrity sportsman, footballer, and African descendants. And he said they are different, but not very different experiences, like different in terms of the historical background and how they define themselves. But when they're out in the streets, the perception and the treatment they received are the same. So yeah, these collection of moments also made me wonder about the history of Blackness within that geography, and to say and to search for the history of that encounter, actually, the Blackness and the Ottoman Anatolia, and take that history from there to early Turkish public.
Okay, thank you. There is a question from Huda Mizudet. I hope I didn't massacre your last name, Huda, please forgive me. I'm curious if there were cases of Afro-Turks who held or hold names of former slave masters, white families from Ottoman period. I mean, if after manumission of former Black slaves continue to hold names of their former masters, or was the Turkish Republic surname law did away with this? I think the case in Tunisia, former Ottoman province, where many ex-West African slaves continue to hold their former slave masters' names after the name change law under former Tunisian President Bourguiba after independence in 1956.
Yeah, I know the Tunisian case, but I haven't come across the same practice in Turkish Republic. So I haven't come across any formerly enslaved person carrying the same surname with the former master.
Okay, now there is a question from Deniz Ruiz. She says, Blackness is always entangled with dehumanization through metaphors of primitive, animal, savage, and monster used to describe racialized populations, as well as its implicit or explicit historical references to racial slavery, colonial genocides, and everyday violence. You pay attention to the embodied aspect of Blackness as well. Would you like to comment on how you see the relationship between dehumanization, violence, and embodiment in this context?
Thank you, Deniz. That perception also benefits from the transatlantic slavery and its huge discourse of how Black bodies can be something like to be sold, and like materialization of Black bodies since then creates the real source of that humanization and that perception, I guess. And violence and also comes from that history, because like after the US history, but like after 1865, the slavery was abolished, but then the criminalization of Black bodies was arranged in order to keep these fields full after the emancipation. So this dehumanization and violence history and association with Blackness comes from the transatlantic discourse of slavery, African slavery, I guess.
Okay. Well, I think if you have any more questions, I hope I didn't skip any questions. If I did, please remind me now. Looking now.
I think we got them all. I can see.
Okay. You can see too. All right. Okay. Well, so then let me thank you, Ezgi, for this really wonderful, stimulating talk. It really made us think, and I'm sure our audience would join me wishing you the best in your research, your endeavor. And I'm really looking forward to the outcome, the dissertation, to read it, and hopefully, the book that will come out of it. This was wonderful. And thank you everyone for joining us today, and please stay tuned. We have, other exciting events and talks coming up.